I know this is kind of a silly suggestion, but it just occurred to me because I used to live in Washington State. And we frequented the Puget Sound, and it's just the most beautiful country. I call it God's country, whatever that means, but it's just gorgeous there. But I have to wonder if maybe the human beings at that time were somehow shielded or influenced or protected by the well, I call them elementals, but basically what they are is the spirits of the forest. The etheric sort of imprints or impressions of the energy of water, the energy of earth, the energy of that sort of thing. I do wonder if they were just so influenced by that because it was something that was so true and so real that they couldn't be influenced by a lie. They couldn't be swung in any to worship this god or that god, but sort of cradled by the natural area that they lived in, as opposed to the people that didn't have that. They didn't have that, the trees and the rivers and the mountains to sort of ground them, bring them home, bring them back to what what really matters. And maybe that had something to do with their choice to kind of give up so easily. The next thing I wanted to...
Yeah, it may well have been the case. Yeah, now that I think of it, poor people in deserts, you don't have much in the way of sustenance there. No. So you do have a level of dependency on whatever is your food and shelter source that is not the case here.
Right.
And, we also know that the Salish, for instance, when they harvested lumber for the longhouses, they never cut trees down. They would excise big chunks out of the cedar trees to build the longhouse, and then go on to the next cedar tree and the next cedar tree, not damaging the Cambrian layer enough to cause the tree to die. And so it was an interesting way to live. And they were intimately tied into the thinking in terms of elementals being expressed as beings. Yeah. So, the salmon and the raven, etc. Mm-hmm. So I would have a tendency to agree that there was something unique about the peoples of the Pacific Rim that gave them a different approach to dealing with the Anunnaki when they came poking around. Now, it's
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Do
you think that there's something to... I do think that the Earth looked different back then, so it's not what we are imagining now in terms of the surface of the Earth or the crust. But do you think that may have something to do with various entry points into what's known as inner Earth? Do you think that has anything to do with the type of terrain that is expressed on the crust of the Earth that sort of reflects, what's going on underneath? Or in your understanding, are there many entrances, or do you even subscribe to the idea?
Okay, so if you want a real intense discussion about what happens on the inside of the Earth, you need to read a book called Thinking and Destiny. And I think it's chapter 11 or 12 that the narrative picks up about that, because it's not as we would understand it, okay? But I do agree with you that the nature of the planet changes. We're in the midst of one of those changing periods now. It's continually expanding. That expansion creates a honeycomb effect inside of Earth, just by the nature of that expansion. And it's all energetic. And so the closer you are to the point of an expansion event, the more energy you're going to get, the different energy, or the energy will be different in component than those more stable parts of the planet. And so you're going to take away a different view of what's actually going on around you. Mm-hmm. And it's going to, I think, inform and help create the psychology, the personality of the peoples involved. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is very key. Now, in terms of the inner Earth, you've got all different kinds of suppositions, theories, et cetera, but we have a continuous legacy of humanity in all of its myths describing the underworld. And usually that underworld description would have us understand it to be that place that's on the other side of death. Now, but many of these descriptions are in fact, while they may have been altered over time by those people that had a vested interest in doing so, there's a core um, of reliable description that does seem to indicate an actual hole into the planet in which there's larger holes and things to be discovered. And so I'm of the opinion that that is the case, that the crust itself is just this thin layer that we inhabit. Now, I'm also of the opinion that the expando Earth theory is quite correct, that back when the Memo came and they had the accident, the Earth was not as we see it now, and enough time passed between them going away to figure out the cure for the copper poisoning and then coming back that we'd gone through many expansion events and the Earth had altered totally, because there's a couple of things within the Dogon and one or two within the Salish that said when Memo came back, they were, let's just say, mildly surprised at the amount of extra work they had to do just because the planet had grown so much in the intervening time. And so, yeah, so it gets really complicated and twisty when you start going down there. And you'll see people that defend the ideas about the hollow Earth as though their own ego is on the line. And I have a tendency to think, to try and maintain my my mental plane such that if I find that something I think of as a fact has dispute or doubt, I'll drop it and see if I can incorporate something else in there that makes more sense. And a lot of people get fixated on a particular paradigm or worldview and then attempt to shoehorn everything into it and also attempt to defend it continuously as though their own ego was on the line.
Ah, human beings.
I know. They're pesky little critters, yes.
Flat Earth, that's another one that's just divided people.
Well, okay, now flat Earth. Okay, so flat Earth can be traced to a memo that came out of the E-ring in the Pentagon in the 2002-2004 period of time. Okay, and that's where the idea of the flat Earth, and also if you look at a lot of the organized parts of the flat Earth groups, you'll see that behind the scenes, there's a little bit of money flowing in that's got to be coming from government. So I think that that the flat Earth resurrection at this point is somebody's psyop. And it is coincidental to me that, and meaningfully so, that the whole thing sprang shortly after we discovered the giant magnetic anomaly in Antarctica in 2002. Okay, so in 2000 and maybe it was 1999, a couple of satellites are put up. These satellites do magnetic imaging of our magnetosphere, and they fly around the planet, circular around the planet, and they take images of all the magnetic anomalies everywhere. And one of the reasons for doing so is to update your nautical charts. So you, because of course the magnetism on the Earth is not ubiquitously even. And so if you've got a particular kind of a compass and you're sailing out on the ocean, you may actually sail over an area of a magnetic anomaly and your compass goes wonky. And so your course becomes very erratic until you discover another area and get your magnetism all lined up again. And so there was some thought to create really accurate magnetic anomaly charts from all over the planet, and these satellites were part of the process. And in doing so, they happened to pass over Antarctica, and both satellites detected this huge magnetic anomaly, a magnetic anomaly so strong that it actually pulled the satellite down ever so slightly out of its orbit as it passed over. And this magnetic anomaly was since investigated, hushed up, and so on. But it's a big bugger. And it happened in 2002 that it was officially recorded. And then very shortly thereafter, we started getting a lot of the flat Earth memes coming out in their nascent form out of the organizational psyops mills out of the Pentagon. And why there is the connection, I don't know, but I think that it is meaningful that the two were temporally coincident.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a great tidbit for people to chew on. You know, in the community, just, you know, those two things coincide the way that they do. And the question that I've had is very much, you know, what do they have to gain by getting us to believe that the Earth is flat? You know, how would that change our perspective in a way that interests them in some way? A couple of questions before I forget. A, do you believe that we currently have, or to your knowledge, do you think that there is any kind of study with the liquid copper technology that you mentioned? Do you think human beings have attempted anything to kind of recreate that, or no, not no?
I don't see any. It was quite clearly described, and you'll see it referenced in the Egyptian and other motifs as the bull's horns with the sphere in between.
Oh.
That's not the sun. That was a representation of the copper engine, that of the liquid copper plasma that was created that drug the ship behind it. And it's always on a headdress, and it's always prominent and so on. I think we got stuck in the Anunnaki technology, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the Anunnaki technology is different. It's the same kind of thing that we see with the Greys and the crashed spaceships. And these are all cyclotron based, okay?
Right.
Now,
it's like kindergarten.
but see, here's the thing too. The Memo were very long lived. All right, they, in their watery environments, they might live several thousand years for all I know, but they were long lived enough that they didn't really consider a multi-light year journey to be any kind of a particular burden to them. Some of the other creatures here, the Anunnaki and the Greys, the clones, and so on, these are beings where time is of an essence. And so they don't want to go travel through the interstellar medium. They want to zip around it, so to speak, by folding time and space together. And so what they do is they had an entirely different kind of a technology. I was just actually discussing this about the Cape Girardeau, Missouri UFO crash in 1941. Because that was where we first came across the idea of what they called a neutronic engine, or a non-radioactive radioactive engine, or non-radioactive nuclear engine. And so that's what the Anunnaki used in their travels. And the way that it works is that you have a cyclotron that is a clear tube, a particle collider, and you shoot a particle through that tube, accelerate it enough, and then you have that particle wrap around a particular atom of a particular mineral, particular element 115. And when it does so, it causes, if you will, an energetic burst that folds time on itself along with space. And so you need only move in the spaceship, you only need to move the spaceship a millimeter to the left once this thing is activated, and you're off of this palm onto this palm. And then when the energy goes away, those two palms separate, and you find yourself in Alpha Centauri without having to transit in between, in that space in between, because it effectively folds space out of the proposition, and you transit. So you're traveling outside of time. And time literally does not exist where you do the traveling this way. And as a result of which, the transit is nearly instantaneous, and the ever-present now is basically the same. So you're here 1 second in Earth, and then the next second you're on Alpha Centauri. And there is no intervening seconds where there was a transit from one spot to the other, because the location was moved to suit you, so to speak. So we're trapped with that technology because of the Roswell crash, because of the Cape Girardeau crash 6 years before, because of the Aurora incident in the late 1800s, et cetera. All of these machines had that same kind of a construct. Now, maybe today the Memo used that as well. So maybe it was like, originally we were all in electric cars in the 1890s, and then we made the transition to gas engines. And so everybody ultimately had to, as a car manufacturer, had to get away from electricity and start manufacturing gas engines, because that was the big deal at the time. And so it may be that if we encounter the Memo today, that they're not even transiting through interstellar space the way they used to, because millions of years have passed, fashion has changed, engines have changed, et cetera, right?
Yeah, sure. Right. No, that makes sense to me that the entities or the beings that were, looked at time as a precious commodity and as a rush, a race against the clock. But if I understand correctly, the Nemo had knowledge of both kinds of technology, but because their existence wasn't as time sensitive, they chose to use the liquid copper technology, which I just find so super fascinating because I have had recurring visions, for lack of a better term, of these gold spherical objects that encompass an enormous amount of energy. They have all different kinds of functions, most namely interstellar travel. Do you think that human beings have been subjected? Could we handle that kind of technology, the human vessel as it is right now? Could we sustain our flesh and blood and bones? Could we handle that kind of?
Yeah, we can actually live and use those technologies. Reputedly from the woo-woo world, there are instances you can find where people have been taken on repaired space alien craft, and they seem to survive. It whacks us out a little bit mentally, okay?
Right.